So Consumer
Take it
Reports
back for the
magazine
way.
from the March issue.
Sure, just
Click radio.
do you have a still a bad time card? Do you have free money? Are you on free money?
In the great amount of press about Peter Mayle generated by his bestsellers A Year in Provence and then Toujours Provence, it's strange, but somehow a dog always managed to insinuate his way into the vast majority of the photos. A big shaggy beast of a dog with a raffish grin. And for all of you who've been left to wonder about Peter Mayle's hirsute companion with this Gallic bon ami, at last there's a book about his emergence as a canine celebrity. It's called A Dog's Life, just out from Knopf, and it is filled with engaging illustrations by Edward Corrin. Peter Mayle has graciously agreed to visit our WNYC studios again to discuss the fortunate life of his dog called Boy. Hi, nice to see you.
Hello there.
And I did expect to see the dog here. After all, this book is told in his voice, or his bark, or whatever.
He doesn't really like cities. He's never been in a city in his life and has very rarely been exposed to anything more sophisticated than a forest path. So I think he would probably misbehave and eat half a studio if he was here.
This is in a long line of books about dogs. I remember Jackie Suzanne wrote one, and Barbara Bush wrote about her dog.
That's right, yeah.
The difference is this is a dog who...
Well, I think the difference is that it is written from his point of view, in his words, and in his literary voice, if you like. Because I remember reading and loving books by Thurber about his dogs, and it's rather daunting to try to write a book about your own dog in the same method as Thurber used to do it. So, but the other thing is, I just find the idea of him looking at the follies of the human condition and commenting on them rather funnier than I could ever make it by writing about him. So,
but what do you say to all of those Peter Mayle fans who read your books to find out about some secret restaurant that may have been overlooked in Provence, or some secluded glen that they weren't able to find?
There'll be more of those, I guess, later on, but no, it was something that happened over the course of a few years, because he was an abandoned dog. My wife found him on the outskirts of the village in very bad condition.
How old was he? Now he's 8 years old. Right?
We think he was 1, we reckon. I mean, the only way you could tell was looking at his teeth. He had no passport on him and no means of identification, so the vet said that he was probably about 1. And because he was an abandoned dog, he's really rather almost clinging, in that he will shadow you around the house. And I've in fact shared an office with him now for 7 years. He comes to work with me when I go to write.
How is he to work with? Does he was he forthcoming when you were writing this book? Or did he insist on going out for a walk every chance he could?
He's placid and inspirational, really, because he's in many ways he has this sort of ruminative side to his nature. Once he's been out for the morning and he knows he's not going to go out again until the afternoon, he's quite content to sit and let the muse wash over him and pass whatever he wants to onto me. So he's a very nice companion to have, because every time you look at him, and there's frequent times when you're writing when you stare at anything for inspiration, any time you look at him, he'll raise his head and the tail will just start to quiver and he'll look at you. And I find that much more inspirational than staring at a wall or looking at the weather. So he was good. He was a very nice companion to have.
But a story has to have conflict. What kind of conflict is there in the life of a dog living in one of the most beautiful places in the world, owned by a man who lives the ideal life, if we're to judge from your books?
Well, the conflict, I think, is inherent in him wanting to have his own way in a human world, which I have to admit that he does by and large. Particularly when you think of him coming from a very underprivileged background, as he did, and his first experience with people, I think, was the hard end of a boot and some fairly unhospitable treatment from his previous owners, who I think also threw him out of a car. And so it's a sort of success story in a way, in that he's now, from the rough country lad, he has become quite a sophisticated dog who spends a great deal of his time not only under my desk but under the dining table, And his observations on our slightly suspect friends take up quite a large part of the book, and that's how, in fact, how he's picked up a lot of his education from them.
They say that writers create themselves in their characters. I'm getting the feeling in listening to this story that this is to some degree Peter Mail's story. Somebody who feels he started fairly low, then had some success of one sort or another, and now lives the idyllic life, envied by some for it. But it's,
yeah, well, I mean, that's the way
pulled
life
himself
goes.
up.
Well, his story and mine have some similarities. We've been working in parallel for 7 years, as I say. So,
Yeah, but yours predates that in England.
oh, sure, but I don't think I could ever have claimed to have been an underprivileged child. I mean, it's.
I thought working in advertising was different. You did work in advertising for years, and
I
some
certainly
people
did.
considered themselves underprivileged when they work in that business.
Sure. Well, I mean, they have a choice. They can always get out. And what I find difficult to take often is that, first of all, people seem to consider advertising some form of black magic, which it certainly isn't. And secondly, it is not always a grind. I had a terrific time in advertising for about 10 years, and then it started to get a little bit less terrific after that.
There is a burnout factor for some people.
Well, I think it's a business where you need a tremendous amount of enthusiasm because you are almost always selling something to somebody, you know, an idea to a client, or trying to sell soap to the public, or your boss on a new idea or something. And to do that, you have to feel, quite passionate about what you're trying to sell, and you have to do it with a certain amount of vigor. And I found, after about 13, 14 years, my vigor quotient was running down rather. And I also wanted very much to write something that was a little bit more permanent than an ad in a newspaper or a magazine. I had these sort of delusions of literary competence. And so I wrote a small children's book, when I was still in the business. And it was curiously well received, and I thought, well, that's it. That's what I'll do. It's very easy. You just write a book, you go to a publisher, he prints 50,000 copies, and you're there.
And you're rich.
And so that's when I really decided to give advertising up. And then
you moved to Provence?
No, and then began a period of about 10 years of relative poverty and rejection and dismay all around. And it took me that long to sort of learn my business properly, and to establish some contacts, and to establish a body of work where I could be taken reasonably seriously by a publisher.
How many books before A Year in Provence?
Quite a few. I mean,
but in this country, we're only aware of that one because that's the one that burst on the scene.
Well, I mean, the very first one did well. It was called Where Did I Come From? It was a book about sex education for children. And that's still in print after 23 years, and I still, to my
Still doing it the same way?
alarm and embarrassment, of course. But I mean, the thing is, it's always new to every child, isn't it? And it's always new to every parent who has to tell every child. So I think that's probably why it's sustained its life for so long.
When did you switch from children's books to adult books?
I did some sort of adult books on advertising and assorted subjects, short books in England, and I was able to use words of more than 2 syllables, which was a great blessing for me. But and then what I wanted to do was to write a novel, and I had the story, and I wanted the novel to be set in Provence, and we had ambitions to live in Provence for many years, and so eventually we made the hop, and I was going to settle down in rural tranquility and just do nothing but write this novel for 6 months. And I found I couldn't possibly concentrate on it because of all that was going on around me.
Which became the book.
Which indeed became the book, and that was only sort of kicked out of me by my agent in London, who said, for God's sake, do something. You can't just sit there and have a nice time. I think he was feeling sort of fairly grouchy at the time, and it was raining as usual in London. And so he said, well, why haven't you started this novel? And I said, well, it's actually too interesting what's going on here to divert myself into work. So he said, well, you've got to write something. Why don't you write about what's going on? And send me some pages, which I did, and then he found a publisher.
And now, interestingly, there are some people who resent the success that you've gotten from that. British press has been after you.
Oh, yeah.
But I'm sure there are people in Provence who say, everything was great here before Peter Mail. Oh, American tourists who say, gee, I used to love that place. Now it's crawling with people because they read Peter Mayle.
There's an interesting attitude towards tourists by people, I find. And you're quite right. I've received a fair amount of flack from the British press.
For that and other reasons.
Well, I mean, the thing they really can't take is the fact the book's been so popular. That is sin number one in Britain, is actually to have a success and to enjoy it. That is absolutely not allowed. So they've had a go at me for that. But to go back to the tourist question, what I find so interesting about that is that you hear all these people talking in disdainful terms about tourism ruining various parts of the world. And yet if you were to turn around to them and say, I presume because you have such a profound detestation of tourists that you're not one yourself and that you never go anywhere, they say, what do you mean? And you say, well, where are you going on vacation this year? And they say, well, you know, as usual to the Côte d'Azur or somewhere like that. But it's not them who are tourists, and it's not their friends who are tourists. It's all those other rascals out there.
They want it in the other guy's neighborhood, not their own.
Absolutely, and it's so consistent, that, and they actually don't want to deal with it. Now, as far as tourism in Provence is concerned, I think while the seeker after life being the same as it was 25 years ago may be disappointed, I think the French themselves are actually quite pleased to get tourism because agricultural business is taking a bit of a beating now.
And the area was really suffering for a time. I read that people were trading houses for broken down cars at one point.
I know a man who bought a house. He's actually the founder of the Lacoste School of Art, and he bought a house in this village of Lacoste, which is a beautiful stone village. He bought a house for a refrigerator, and then he bought another one for $50. I think that was a long, long time ago.
And now it's expensive.
It is pretty expensive, yeah. But I think there's been a tremendous migration south from Paris. I mean, there's another village called Gordes, which is highly popular with the Parisians, and is actually called Saint-Germain Sud by some people.
A small town with 3 famous restaurants.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's one of the great joys of that part of the world, that no matter where you are in that area, you can always go within 20 kilometers or so, you'll find somewhere very nice to eat.
Although there's a town nearby that's called Apt, but it's the least apt place to go.
It is absolutely wonderful if you happen to love preserved fruits, because there's some people up in the hills make preserved fruits in the old-fashioned way, which is, you know, hideously over sugared, but absolutely delicious. But apart from that, it's a sort of fairly yes, it's not a particularly picturesque place.
The British have been after you, but so has your dog. He portrays you as a rather dim-witted soul in this book.
Well, he has to judge by his own personal experience, and I have to admit that I am not the world's handiest person, and yet I get involved in doing things around the house because it's actually quicker than waiting for somebody to come, and certainly cheaper. And I do tend to wound myself from time to time with rocks or with hammers or with items of equipment that I'm really not competent to do. I nearly cut my finger off with a sickle chopping the lavender down there a couple of years ago. And I think he regards me as a bit of a stumble bum, quite honestly.
As a dog who reads Proust and other things,
yeah,
you'd assume that he would have very high standards. Peter Mayle's previous books include A Year in Provence, Toujours Provence, and Hotel Pastis. That book brought him to New York and Company a couple of years ago. His latest is called A Dog's Life, and has drawings by Edward Corrin, who makes everybody look hairy, but that's nice.
He's the prince of the hirsute image, he is.
And it's published by Knopf. We will continue after we take a little break here on New York and Company on AM 820 WNYC, New York Public Radio. We hope you can stay with us. So, that's not too painful, right?
No.
Very easy anyway.
Oh, it's very pleasant.
Atlanta authorities say at least one person has died in the collapse of a section of the new Olympic Stadium. James Argroves of Peach State Public Radio reports.
Fire officials say one construction worker died and 3 others were injured when a metal support beam collapsed around 11:30 this morning at the construction site of the new Olympic Stadium. Eyewitnesses say the workers were standing on the end of a 50-foot steel beam putting up a bank of lights at the top of the stadium. Apparently, the weight on the steel girder was too much, and it collapsed, falling about 150 feet into what will be the seating area of the stadium. The 3 injured workers were taken to an Atlanta hospital, but there are no details on their condition.
No,
Several
I haven't read it.
ambulances are at the scene.
I'm not going to ask because he
For
doesn't
National
know.
Public Radio,
Just
I'm James
embarrassing.
R. Groves in Atlanta.